As a kid, I was raised in a small fishing community on the eastern side of Canada, surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and boreal forest. The entirety of the land was close to 4,000 foot square, with an even smaller number of residents spread out over Main Street, the main road running straight through our little town. And farming houses spread widely between areas of trees that were changed to domestic residential homes when agriculture stopped being profitable. In total, our country is surrounded by a vast expanse of ocean and a seemingly endless barrage of trees that spread over 55% of Canada's entire country. I spent most of my life hunting in those woods, so you can imagine my joy when my parents got me a hunting dog. Sandy was a Shetland sheepdog, and while it was more fit to be herding and tracking sheep over grassy plains rather than rabbits and deer through the dense forest, it didn't stop me from taking him with me on every excursion I possibly could. Sandy had been by my side for enough hunting trips that he had grown accustomed to waking up just before breaking daylight, and on a few occasions helped track down small game like squirrels and rabbits through considerably large areas of forest. Sandy wasn't my property, and wasn't treated like he belonged to me. Sandy was a member of the family, my best companion, my truest friend. I think fondly back on all the times he sat in my front seat of the truck without being told, ready to go for a walk in whatever part of the forest I took him to. I can honestly say that there will never be a dog to fill the void Sandy left for me. I find that dog lovers relate to the same sentiment more than others. It was October 30th, the first day of deer hunting season. I had been talking with my family about taking Sandy, my hunting gear, and some essentials to one of the cabins my grandfather owned in his heyday off an unmarked road a few hundred miles into the wilderness for a few days. This was met with a lot of protesting, but nothing could stop me from getting in some time looking for wild game in an area that wasn't already picked clean by illegal hunters earlier on in the month. Everything was packed into the old blue Ford, Sandy included, and only a few hours of driving later, we were setting up camp in one of my grandfather's secluded old cabins. Here's where things got stirred up. Sandy, I'm so sorry. I had spent most of the time of my life being in the wilderness. There were only a handful of times where things had gotten weird for me, but usually everything can be explained with scientific reason. That's why I brushed off Sandy's weirdness on the first few nights, chalking it up to the nervousness of a dog that's capable of hearing far-off noises of various coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. This was an untouched territory, of course. There had been plenty of times for wildlife to set up camp here too. The first night was fairly normal. I had set up Sandy's bed in the corner of the living room, next to the TV that looked like it came out of the early 90s. I figured I'd give Sandy an option to have some place to lay down for a while, despite the fact that he slept curled up with me 9 times out of 10. Close to 10 at night, Sandy looked straight at the wooden door and whined. I figured he'd need the pee, and I opened the door to let him out, not to worry about having my best friend stray too far from me. Instead, he just sat inside the door, looking out at the forest edge beyond the path. I, too, stood and looked for a few minutes before deciding that he had just heard an errant creature close to the cabin. The rest of the night was fairly normal, and Sandy slept with me fine. The second night, I chalked the weirdness up to Sandy's stress. Earlier in the day, we had been walking a few miles through the woods beyond the house, and I thought I heard the sound of twigs cracking under something heavy. I hoped it wasn't a moose because my shotgun wouldn't have stood a chance, but something changed in Sandy that I did not pay close attention to at the time. He hunched himself on his hind legs, his front pressed close to the ground. His mouth pulled up over his teeth, and he grabbed towards nothingness. I figured we'd try hunting again later, if whatever it was had left and should he be feeling up to it. But once we were inside, he didn't want to move. Even when I tried to get him to go outside to do his business, he sat at the door and cried, wailing at me to let me know that he didn't want to go out there. I didn't pressure him. If he peed on the floor, so be it. Sandy never acted up before. I could excuse an accident or two, if he didn't really want to be out there. It must have been a bear, I thought to myself before locking the door and calling it a night. The third night is where things went down, no sleep, and I still don't fully understand what happened. Sandy didn't eat all day. I managed to shoot a rabbit in the early morning. When Sandy decided he didn't want to be outside any longer than he had to, and retired inside for the day, I cooked it up, threw a little gravy on it, and gave it to my dog. I didn't do this all the time, but I figured now was a special occasion, and maybe a treat would put him in a better mood for another walk the next day. Sandy didn't touch it. He didn't so much as sniff it. Instead, he sat at my side on the couch, watching the doorway intently. I tucked him under my arm, and he laid his head on my lap, eyes still locked on my door. Close to 3 hours after watching grainy VHS tapes on an outdated television set, Sandy started crying, hugging himself close to my body. This is where my judgment took me down the wrong path, for the first time of many. It must sound silly, being my dog's protector rather than my dog being mine, but this was my family. I figured if something out there was scaring Sandy so bad, then it was my job to do something about it. I loaded my 410, opened the door, and stood in the doorway, and waited. I must have waited at least half an hour, staring into nothing. There was barely any sound, save for the faint buzz of insects and leaves rustling in the cold autumn wind. Moose aren't elegant creatures, and if it were a moose, I would have heard it coming. Around the 40-minute mark, Sandy took off like a shot, into the darkness of the trees beyond the path, barking wildly. I started to get worried. Despite my knowledge that my dog isn't entirely helpless in the wilderness, there were still bigger animals that would have liked to take a bite of him if there wasn't a lot of food for the winter. I heard Sandy's bark fade away in the distance and stop altogether. I waited hours standing at the doorway with my shotgun cocked and ready to put down whatever it was waiting in the woods. I waited hours for Sandy to come back to the house. I waited until the sun was cracking through the trees. And then I waited until that night, sitting on my porch step, fending off sleep deprivation, to see my dog come back. Sandy did come back, but not for another 3 days. Fog had rolled in at this point, and it was getting darker, the midnight painting the sky a navy blue. Tracking over the last few days proved futile. I started to get worried that I'd need to leave to find more provisions to last me the next few nights. I couldn't leave Sandy out there, lost in the woods, cold and probably hungry. The thought that he might be waiting out there for me to find him and bring him back home was distressing enough. I was packing the bag that hung on the coat rack next to the door with what I need for the next day's trip. I figured tomorrow would be the last day before I go into town to see if my father would help me find Sandy. He was a retired graying man, but I was sure if I brought up Sandy's name he'd be more than willing to help me search for him. Thankfully, Sandy came back before I'd even finished that train of thought. I saw him from the window, on the path that led down to the main road, a few dozen feet away from my house. Nearly I'd hear him scamper to the doorway and paw at the door a few times, eager to come in. But this was different. I could see the reflection of his eyes and the green pearls in the murky fog that had swamped the house. For a moment I thought it might have been an animal, but the outline of his body and the wisp of the thick low-lying clouds was unmistakable. Still, despite myself, I hesitated. There was something different about his body language. I stared out the window for a few more moments before reason overcome my gut instinct. Sandy could be hurt, I thought, or worse. I flung the door open, but he didn't come right away. Instead, he stood there, watching me intently, and when he didn't move, I whistled to him. "Here, Sandy." I coaxed him toward the house. "Here, boy." The way he moved was different. It was as if though his hips had been dislocated, and the angle of his paws changed direction with every step, as if though he'd forgotten how to walk properly. His head bowed to the ground. His teeth weren't bare, though. He didn't seem aggressive. The only way I could describe the look he gave me was sheepish. Like he'd just gotten into something he wasn't supposed to, and I yelled at him for it. I thought he might hurt himself hopping up onto the elevated step if he had dislocated his hip, but he did just fine. His back half swung a little, oddly enough, and his paws was folded underneath himself, but he didn't go sprawling. He sat on the step, and he did not take his look off me. It wasn't until I had moved from the doorway completely, opened the door wide, and waited for him to walk in that he moved. Straight to his bed. He didn't stop at my hand and sniff at me. He didn't wait for pets or jump up on me like he used to do. It was straight to his bed, where he sat and watched me for quite some time afterwards. I returned to the movie at hand. I called to him a few times, but he didn't respond. His ears didn't so much as raise to the sound of my voice, or the pat of my hand on the worn-out couch beside me. I had missed my buddy, but I wasn't about to move him physically toward me. There was something about him that I said I shouldn't have let him in, but I chalked it up to silliness, and a few hours later I went to bed. The more I think back on it, I don't recall him blinking once. He just sat there like a statue. And when I turned off the light, I could still see the reflection of Jade Green following me as I went to my room and shut the door. I could have sworn I heard him walk in the night, the sound of nails clicking against the wooden floor coming up to my door. But they were slow and deliberate. They weren't like the quickness of Sandy realizing I had gone to bed and coming to curl up. I heard the noises stop outside my bedroom, but I didn't hear his whine. I thought nothing of it and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up in the morning, I figured it must have been a dream. Sandy was still sitting in an upright position I left him in when I went to bed, as if though he didn't move a muscle the entire night. When I said good morning, he didn't so much as wag his tail. He did follow me into the kitchen, but he paused at the doorway when I put his bowl down on the floor and filled it with supermarket dog food. Once again, his back half moved weirdly as he slowly made his way towards me. There was a nagging feeling that something was off-putting about the way that he looked that day. It was like he had gotten a little longer overnight. Sandy hunched down again, like when he was walking to the door that night before. He didn't come into the kitchen. I figured he must have been hungry after being out in the wild for so long. But he eyed me like he was waiting for me to come a little closer rather than touch the food. It goes without saying, but after a few moments of a staring contest between me and my unblinking dog, I called off that foolishness and called his name out loudly. Not even a flinch. I didn't want to move closer to my dog to leave the kitchen door, but this was my Sandy. The most damage he'd ever done was eat flies. Sure enough, as I passed him, he turned, and his body swayed unnaturally. But he didn't move towards me. When I left that day, I couldn't find anything. The deer tracks in the mud were made a few days prior and went cold off naturally, made trails through the woods. I couldn't hear bugs or birds, or even the howl of a nearby coyote. The only sound from miles away from the campsite were my own breathing and the sounds of crunching leaves under my feet. When the sun started to set, I started making my way back. I should have packed my stuff up and left. Just behind a cluster of trees, with a house just visible beyond their eyes, I figured I found out the reason why the animals had abandoned this place. Generally, when there are mass animal deaths, that usually means something is wrong with the area of the slaughter. And wildlife are usually smart enough to get the hell out of Dodge. Even cats are bred instinctively not to like drinking water that is close to where their food is. Because if you saw a dead animal close to a stream, you'd figure the stream was tainted and find another source of water. Hundreds of squirrels were disemboweled and strewn across the grass in a perfect circle. Most of them were skinned alive. But when I turned to heave up all the contents in my stomach, there were a few dozen that were inside out. I couldn't help but to vomit repeatedly as I tried my best to walk around the circle of tiny organs and mashed up bodies. Not just over the sight, but because the smell was ungodly. I don't know how long they must have been out here. But if I had stumbled across this sooner, I'd left with Sandy in a tow immediately after. Gradually, the body stopped and delved off into a random dead squirrel here and there. The biggest thing I managed to find, just a few feet off from the unholy feeding ground, was a deer. It looked as if someone had decided to skin it alive from head to neck, and draped some of the skin over a branch like someone was tanning the hide. I don't know how long it had been there, but it smelled like it had been there for quite some time, despite the fact that there wasn't a single freaking fly. The head had been cut off clean just above the shoulders, and when I realized that the organs had been removed, I moved from a walking pace through the woods to a jog. Thankfully, the cabin wasn't too far off. I heaved one final time, wiped my mouth on the back of my sleeve, and I looked up to the house to see Sandy watching me from the window. I tried to reason myself and tell myself Sandy's odd behavior could have been trauma. I know it's stupid to think of it now, but at the time, it was the only reasonable explanation I had to keep myself from going insane. The elongating body could have just been from loneliness getting to me. Sandy had realized there was something up with this place, and the second he noticed it, I should have taken this warning and taken off back into town. It'd be dangerous to try to maneuver my way through the trails at night, as the hills of Kelly's Mountain were steep, and the pitch darkness with my only companion being my headlights. It would have been easy to slide off the ravine and never be heard from again. I didn't want to stay one more night, but I had no choice. I had gotten back to the house just moments before the sun finally receded past the horizon, and we were bathed in the navy blue sky once again. I didn't pay attention to Sandy. He just sat at his bed and watched me pack. I figured no harm, no foul. I'd throw his stuff into the truck in the morning, and we'd be back in town before night the next day. Glancing at him for just a moment, it was a passing thought that he was looking a little longer today. And when I went to bed, it was a hard time getting sleep for the next few hours. It must have been close to 4 or 5 in the morning when I heard it. The sound of whistling, the same whistle I used to call my dog. I broke out into a cold sweat when I realized that whoever slaughtered those squirrels hung the skin up, left what they didn't need. Could have been very well broken into my house. The door to my room didn't make a sound as I opened it slowly, thankfully. I waited a moment, listening to the person call my dog for a few more seconds before I dared poke my head out from the door to get a good look at whoever it was that could have hurt Sandy. The outside door was open. All I saw was the back half of Sandy, too long and lanky, almost coiled around the back of the door. His front half was outside. Whatever it was that had impersonated my dog, it was whistling slowly, calling for Sandy, when I could have sworn it had hunched down to the ground again. And it said, "Sandy." The most ungodly voice I'd ever freaking heard. I closed the door just as softly as I opened it. I don't know how long I waited with my back pressed against the door. I knew I left my gun in the bag on the coat rack. I know I didn't sleep. I waited until I saw the sun break over the horizon. And then I waited some more, until it must have been midday, and I finally got the balls to open the door and make a break for the truck. I wouldn't die in that place. Sandy was gone, and the door was open. His food was untouched, but the fridge was open, and all the meat was gone. I didn't bother packing his stuff. I just threw my bag over my shoulder, made my way to the floor as fast as I could, and turned on the ignition. I can't describe the feeling that overcome me as I realized I'd have to leave Sandy in this place. The thought that he could be dead was never a thought in my mind. I don't think I could cope with the knowledge that whatever allowed in my house, whatever disemboweled those animals, could have done the same with him. I made my way down the winding path of the roads as fast as I possibly could, without veering off the cliffs. I felt like I was turning in circles down this labyrinth that would take me back to the house, but when I reached the pavement, on the stretch of the road back to town, I felt relief wash over me, thinking I was safe. Just as I was pulling off onto the cement, I felt something hard hit the back of my windshield, sending broken glass into the passenger seat. I only got a glimpse of a deer's decapitated head, catching on unbroken glass and tumbling into the back seat. I cried for most of the way home, hands clenching the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I wish I could leave this off with a positive note. I wish I could tell you that I found Sandy at home, waiting for me. I wish I could tell you that that was the end of it. A traumatizing experience in the woods that I'll get over with time. Last night, I found it hard to sleep. I kept replaying the entirety of the trip to Kelly's Mountain in my head. I figured I would sleep for a while, and lay there, listening to the wind through my open window. I could have sworn I heard their whistle I used to call my dog with, coming from the forest edge. If you go on trips with your dog, I advise you, don't let them out of your sight for too long. What comes back might not be your dog.